Introduction. The question history cannot easily answer. This book argues a direct claim. The Jesus figure presented in the New Testament is best explained as a constructed Messiah, a theological solution that entered the historical record as proclamation first, became biography later, and was then stabilized by canon, creed, and empire. In the surviving record, Christianity does not begin with a contemporaneously documented public teacher. It begins with a divine Christ proclaimed through revelation in Scripture, followed decades later by narrative biographies that expand, diverge, and repeatedly show signs of scriptural shaping. That is not a statement made for shock. It is the conclusion that most consistently fits the order, behavior, and evolution of the sources. The traditional portrait is familiar. Jesus gathers crowds, teaches publicly, confronts civilians, works wonders, is executed by Roman administration under Pontius Pilate, and rises from the dead. If a public figure did what later Gospels claim, at the scale they claim, history would normally leave traces in proportion to that scale. Clearer early notice, earlier documentation, and a more stable biographical core. Instead, the earliest surviving evidence behaves differently. The story enters the record late, grows in layers, and hardens over time through institutional power. This investigation uses a standard historians apply when documentation is limited. Not courtroom certainty, but probability based on chronology and textual behavior. The question is not whether religion can inspire. The question is whether the Jesus story enters the record like preserved biography or like construction through interpretation and tradition. The book rests on three pillars. First is chronology. The earliest surviving Christian writings are letters attributed to Paul, commonly dated to roughly 50-60 CE. They describe Christ as a divine figure revealed through Scripture and revelation, and they focus on theological meaning, death and resurrection as cosmic turning point, without supplying the narrative biography later assumed to be foundational. Only later, around 70 CE, does the first narrative gospel appear as the earliest surviving life story. Later still, Matthew and Luke expand Mark, add in a rugged narratives, genealogies, and extended teaching material while diverging from one another in foundational identity claims. The story is proclaimed first, narrated later, and expanded later still. Second is literary dependence and divergence. Mark, Matthew, and Luke share extensive narrative overlap that indicates that Jesus' biography is developing through text, not simply preserved through independent eyewitness. Recall, Matthew and Luke reuse Mark's narrative spine and then reshape it, adding major new material and altering emphasis. Their expansions do not align on key foundations. Different genealogical structures, different origin frameworks, and different resurrection packaging. When biography behaves like this, template plus revision plus divergence, it points construction through interpretation and tradition rather than stable preservation of a single agreed life story. Third is scriptural architecture. Many gospel scenes frequently appear shaped by earlier Hebrew scripture through prophecy, typology, and interpretive storytelling. Scripture functions not merely as a citation source, but often as a template that guides how scenes are staged, how suffering is framed, and how messianic legitimacy is anchored. Once scripture is treated as blueprint, narrative detail can be generated in a way that feels inevitable within a believing community because it fits older sacred patterns treated as authority. These pillars support the central conclusion. The Jesus figure, as later generations came to know him, does not enter the surviving record as a stable biography rooted in contemporary documentation. He enters first as theological proclamation, becomes biography decades later, and then expands through successive authors and communities. One limitation must be stated plainly at the start, so the book does not spend its pages apologizing for what ancient history cannot provide. The first century did not preserve documentation the way the modern world does, and many sources are lost for that reason. The goal here is not to demand modern paperwork. The goal is to examine how the surviving evidence behaves when the earliest surviving layer is theological proclamation rather than biography, when biography appears later and evolves through revision and contradiction, and when the narrative repeatedly mirrors older scriptural templates. The most consistent explanation is construction through interpretation and tradition. This book is written for readers who feel trapped between two unsatisfying options: accept the traditional story as unquestionable history or dismiss the entire topic as unknowable. There is a third option: follow the evidence.